Welcome to Throne Dynamics Public Broadcasts. We will start in just a couple of moments. Welcome to Throne Dynamics Public Broadcast. I'm Ivan Throne, speaking on behalf of the company. As the founder and chief executive manager of Throne Dynamics, most of you will know me, some of you may not. So I'll give a brief introduction of what we do and who we are. So Throne Dynamics is a non-state actor in this age of militants, this opening days of the Third World War. Today we're going to be covering a number of topics here for you to have a look at, and we're going to begin moving very quickly today with some discussion of what's just taken place with elections for the European Parliament. And right now, the shock across Europe is significant. And so the hard right nationalist movements have seized electoral success, also in France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Greece, and the Netherlands. We've seen a surge in right-wing and hard-right parties and their candidates for the European Union Parliament positions. Now, something important to understand for our American listeners. The way the European Parliament works is that it sets European policy for things like climate, finance, and so on. And each country is apportioned a certain number of seats. And what we're looking at is not a parliament-wide takeover, as what you might see in a two-party situation, but various parties across individual European countries are seeing the hard right surge forward and take majority or a working majority of seats within the segment. Now, there have been some impacts from this, notably among them the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, has dissolved the French parliament and called for national or snap elections later this month. The idea behind that is to forestall this right-wing conservative movement. We'll see what happens there, but it's expected at this point that the hard right will also attain victory in that, although they're not expected to have an absolute majority. The Prime Minister of Belgium has resigned in tears on camera, saying that they've lost. And importantly here, and a very encouraging note for the work of the company and for your defense of your own nations and culture, is that much of this rightward shift in Europe is being driven by youth movements and among the younger Generation Z. Vox Day famously calls Generation Z Generation Zyklon because of how hard right and militant they are becoming. We'll see how this pans out, but it's a very encouraging sign, and one to note that there are opportunities for consolidation here. We'll talk briefly now about the elections upcoming in the United States this fall. Some important points is that Trump, following his 34 convictions, has raised over $141 million for himself in the Republican National Convention in the month of May alone. This is accompanied by a rise in polling over the incumbent President Biden, who has been showing very disturbing, accelerated signs of dementia. Now, here at the company, we don't take a position or necessarily endorse candidates. We're not hostile to the U.S. government. We don't consider there a need to be. And as a non-state actor, it's objectively observable that the crash of the United States and most Western societies is advanced, accelerating, and unstoppable. In this case, with President Biden, it is essentially a case of elder abuse. And recently at the G7 conference, video has emerged You're encouraged to watch the whole thing and not just the snippets there. This shows a visibly confused elderly man wandering off. In addition to this, in these questions that this brings forward on who is in fact governing the United States, we're not going to issue a hypothesis there. Obviously, it's not Biden himself. We're seeing some points being made, some warnings and fears being expressed by members of the intelligence community that should Trump be reelected this fall, that they anticipate potential arrests and tributary prosecutions. You can find that on the news. Specifically, it was a former deputy director of FBI, Andrew McCabe, who had made that comment. There's also in the United States another encouraging sign, which is a shift to the right among young men, more specifically fighting age males. And you see this with the rise of Patriot Front. You see this with the rise of conservative movements such as Charlie Kirk's TPUSA and other indicia of a shift rightward, which will be taken advantage of. Now, on this broadcast today, rather than devolving solely on politics, we're going to talk about some key traction points. Particularly, we have Flashpoint Europe, which is coming up late this fall, and we'll be discussing that more specifically on this broadcast today. We'll talk about the ground dominance work of the company and the movement in the United States, some news on Project Silver Talent and what that represents for you, and for those of you who are engaged in building, fighting, and leading as part of the movement. We'll talk a bit about the executive cadre, some critical continuity industries. Some questions have come up on what exactly does the executive cadre do? What kind of work do they do for the company? And then a little bit about movement factions and some militant groups that we work with today and how we're handling them. Let's talk about Flashpoint Europe. So Flashpoint Europe was planned prior to the election for the European Parliament. We did see what's coming. We keep our finger on the pulse of things. Flashpoint Europe has some very specific purposes, and among them, first of all, is to drive coherence. So picking my word very carefully, so pay attention. Coherence among the hard right leaders that are rising in Europe, across their new parliamentary representatives, the chiefs of staff of those insurgent parties, the development managers, those who are in fact leading. This is not an ideological connection, but rather an enterprise coherence connection. Now, we use the word coherence in many ways. It's not just a matter of things being lined up, it's also cohere, to bring things together. And driving that coherence among hard right leaders is very important. Each of them are struggling within their own nations to advance their interests as a party within their own country, as well as representing their country within an almost federal sort of system within the wider European arena. At this stage, there is not yet a coherence of action. There's not yet a coherence of defensive intelligence. There's not yet a coherence of proactive attack across these various parties. A very far-right militant leader in Greece does not necessarily have an intuitive grasp of what a conservative right leader in Spain will have. That needs to be brought together. There needs to be this coherence. And Flashpoint Europe, with bringing in delegates from these representative parties, will be working to achieve this. It also will ensure enterprise-level strategic competence. And this is something that is additionally important, not just to cohere the leaders and the relationships, but to ensure that over time, an enterprise level or broad pan-European methodology, goals, visions, alignment, all of these things that bring victory forward in the face of what's been 70 to 80 years of dominance from the neoliberal world order. And we end up today with what they speak of as the rules-based order, which is nothing of the sort. If the right wishes to maintain the accelerated momentum and establish victory for their ideologies and their parties and their movements, they must cohere. They must build their enterprise competence. And the role of the company, then, as we are not a party or a church, is to bring in that enterprise expertise and ensure that it is truly and fully explicated and managed on the ground. We will also be driving competence into the hard right activists in Europe. Now, the difference between coherence and competence is very important. Those of you that have taken our raw human capital assessment will understand this linear progression of instruction that the company provides. We begin with capacity, we build coherence, and then we assist with the execution of competence. And the competence is what is needed for the hard right. Building on the example of Patriot Front in the United States, you'll see similar organizations such as Guzenband in Holland or the Netherlands, Vanguard Britannica in the United Kingdom. The competence is still lacking here, however. And in Europe, part of this is cultural, part of this is a more challenging operational environment where Europeans don't necessarily have the cultural attitude of rebellion ingrained in them the way that Americans frequently and should have. The governments over there are also more willing to intervene and criminalize activities. It's just as simply it's a different environment. And we'll be working with them to increase their competence, their effectiveness in dealing with that. Now, one other very important aspect here is there is very often a separation between political leadership, aspirational political leadership, hard militants on the ground or activists, and the integration and relationships between them in a vertical manner. Now, in part, the middle class or the bourgeois, they often say distaste for street activism certainly does play a part in both the United States and in Europe. It's more profound in Europe, which is not surprising, considering that class differences there have been more profound for many centuries. However, it is incredibly important for leaders on the right in those political movements in Europe, not ready yet here in the United States, but in Europe, and as part of the point of Flashpoint Europe. We will be working to integrate and break some of those barriers between the recognition of militants by those parties and acceptance of those parties by militants. And this is a two-way street in the building of fealty between them to strengthen the right infrastructure from top to bottom. Very important thing to understand that while militants can produce political leaders, the parties in Europe will never produce militants. That separation is very dangerous for the cause of the hard right, and we will be working to patch that gap, to close it, and to fortify the relationships there. So that's what we mean by this enterprise level vertical integration. This also enables, if you consider the coherence of leadership, vertical integration, that means the diagonal relationships across Europe between political leaders and militants on the ground forms a web that can take direct offensive action into the left reactionary reflex. And what I mean by reactionary reflex, if you read the news coming from the left, coming from the pundits, the official received wisdom commentators in the European Union and here in the United States, they see that the great flaw in their excuse and their reassurance that the hard right cannot attain power as well as significant representation is its fragmented state and its inability to work coherently together. Flashpoint Europe will solve that issue and provide a web to begin to cut off the left from power. Now, let's move on here in our broadcast and talk a little bit about the ground dominance process that I alluded to and what phone dynamics is doing and how we're doing it, specifically in Texas. Those of you that have read the company reports on ground dominance in Texas will be familiar with what we're speaking of here. Now, it's important here to give you a little bit of background. Following January 6th event, when the Capitol was stormed, insurrected, visited, doesn't really matter, and that's not the focus of it. But one of the outcomes from that was a process that we call shatter and scatter. Of various militant groups, for example, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, other organizations that were involved either directly or tangentially with that J6 event. That shatter and scatter, from decapitation of their leadership in some cases, from just simple slowing off from the ridiculous abortion of an event in January, with stupidity on all sides. However, nonetheless, those people, those militants, have begun organically and inevitably to recoalesce. And this coalescence takes place because of the times. It's not a matter of necessarily of frustration with the state and anger at policy discussed with individual leaders. It has to do with the times themselves. If you ask anyone, is peace going to break out or civil calm in the United States? Of course not. We can all feel that. And naturally, people equate and coalesce and cohere to those of like mind, like vision. And we're seeing that taking place. And in order, again, to bring that coherence, to bring that fostering of competence, the company is identifying those natural leaders with correct posture. What do we mean by correct posture? First off, intelligence, their capacity, their talent for leadership, their track record of organization. Very importantly, the absence of ego and the discipline of leadership must be evident. These are not simple or tawdry things. They are rare in individuals who will selflessly step forward to lead without insisting on self-aggrandizement, without putting their own interests and the adulation of other people ahead of their duty and responsibilities to a movement. And what we do with these men, with their ability to organize, lead, to inspire, to manage, we bring them under the authority of the company with formal acknowledgement, formal fealty. We provide them with the enterprise level guidance, education, training, leadership, inspiration, and support on every level. And that is part of the exchange. That's the fealty. When we speak of fealty, cruelty, and majesty as values of the company, fealty is composed of fear, trust, and awe, and a shared experience. Some of you are familiar with the example that I will often give. A child wanders into the road and the mother pulls it back just in time. That shared fear, anger in the mother, tears in the child. It's a profound experience. There's no evil in it. There's no malevolence. Similarly with cruelty. Cruelty we define as full execution and explication of duty to the last possible delivery. A prosecutor is cruel. A surgeon, a sniper is cruel. There's no evil. There is, to the extent there is a pure heart, full execution of duty. The result is majesty. What is good, what is beautiful, what is true, hierarchy and order, these things that build and sustain civilization. Now, the last piece, and we'll discuss this more in depth during the war briefing for members of the movement. But as we bring these leaders in under formal authority of the company, we establish them as movement factions. Under the standard, we provide explicit, direct, and comprehensive training, guidance, and support. Let's move here to talk about an economic project that Throne Dynamics is working directly within. Now, Project Silver Talent is the brainchild and the work of the company's War Financial. And it's based on an almost anti-Soros. We often refer to him as the anti-Soros, and against the World Economic Forum's much derided mantra of you will own nothing and be happy. By converse, this is you will own things and be proud. You will build them. This is necessary for the revitalization of our people, our culture, our communities. We're very serious about this, and we are taking advantage of existing mergers and acquisition deal flow that the World Financial is already working with. And very simply, what we have identified is the opportunity to take exceptional individuals from the movement and place them into owner-operator positions of critical continuity industries. Buying and selling companies, a new leader needs to be placed in, one who is under the standard, has correct fealty, and does his work not simply as employment, but as sacred purpose to advance the mission of the movement and the company and our allies in the Third World War. Now, critical continuity industries it's worth explaining a little bit. And this ties into where the cadre actually does their work. Agriculture, transportation, armaments, energy. These are industries in which if they break down, so does society. That's why they are critical continuity industries. And the company works very closely with leaders in this field, with insurgent entrepreneurs in this field, and with Silver Talent, we're very proud to be able to open up the opportunity for owner-operators with correct heart, correct mind, and ready hands to do this work, to build, to own, and be proud. Those of you who have interest in this can reach out to the relationship manager of the company. Go ahead and get onto the website, and if you're capable, you'll find how. What this does is creates, by a formal acknowledgement of company authority, this creates the hierarchy, this creates the order that drives and delivers the beauty of civilization itself. This broader vision, enterprise management and mindset, cruel execution of duty and deliverables, all the way down to work packages and tasks. We make sure things are professionally handled, properly managed, and fully executed. And this strong constellation of builders, of fighters, and leaders that results all the way from your fighting age male who has nothing in his future because it's been stripped from him other than to fight literally in an active club. We're there for him. We provide what he needs, all the way to owners of enterprises that we speak with and who turn to us for guidance because our expertise has that full gradient and range. Moving on, we have some questions that came in from the audience, and here's the first one. What is it that young men who join the movement can first expect? What is required to have a place in it? The first thing to expect when you join the movement is that duty will be placed upon you, and you will be made cognizant and aware of responsibilities that you have beyond yourself. The individualism of Western society is a very dangerous thing. It's taken too far, it fragments and atomizes and destroys the culture and the civilization that permitted it. This does not mean that you will be subjugated or that you will submit. We don't seek slaves, we seek men. Men who recognize what we offer, men who recognize our sacred purpose, men who will put themselves forward and adhere to the values that we profess, to the work that we do, and stand beside us and do not leave their brothers behind. That's the first thing you will encounter is accountability and responsibility, perhaps for the first time in many of the young lives of men who work with us. As for what's required, character, sincerity, truth, trainability, willingness to do the work. One of our company values, fuck you, earn it. We expect that. If you don't know, fuck you, find out. That is imperative. That responsibility, that cultivation of power, that fostering of growth, that fealty between men of the movement and the company, between myself and my officers and with you, is a two-way street, always, and it must always be. Here's another question that's been of interest. What can be shared in advance about the upcoming tribunals launch? Now, the tribunals, for those of you who are interested, you can go to tribunals.ai on the internet, and you'll see the initial form there for people to register for more information. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the tribunals, how they're constituted, their area and scope of responsibility and engagement, what we're doing, where we are in the process, how it launches. So the first thing to understand is that the tribunals are not set up to address petty crimes, things like rape, murder, theft, embezzlement. Those are not crimes against a whole people, in a sense. And what we're looking at with the tribunals has much more of a focus on violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This addresses, of course, the pandemic, forced vaccinations, lockdowns, the consequences, and the impacts on people across the world. Does this have to do with elections? Potentially. Force or fraud by political leaders? Yes. One of the other purposes of the tribunals is to lay the groundwork as well for a ensuring of justice's inevitability. Some of you are familiar with unbounded militant artificial intelligence of the company. Centurion AI is referred to. Does have a hand in this, and in the prosecution and the tracking. And the part of the concept of the tribunals is that as the technology advances, not just from if you think that your phone tracks you, wait until your doors and your houses and your coffee tables and your couches track you. Your refrigerator already does. The Internet of Things is something that an unbounded militant AI has the ability to interact with. And as this technology advances, we will ensure that justice cannot be avoided. People need an alternative to the rotting courts that is very clearly today used primarily for political purposes. And again, we're not speaking of small violent crimes. We're speaking of the greater betrayals and war crimes, crimes against humanity that have taken place and continue and will continue to take place. Additionally, there's a concept, and you can read on this, there's a accompanying report on the website that begins to address this just a bit as a leading indicator. We're putting out some initial information for those with eyes to see will recognize what we're doing. Under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, there's a concept called a regularly constituted court. That's a very important consideration when it comes to things like non-international armed conflict and other interactions with insurgent groups, legal systems. Those are profound implications for that. So the tribunals also lay groundwork for that. Now, where are we in terms of actual progress? Right now, we are engaged with the development team. We're working on the platform for it to create the submission platform for people to file complaints, for people to bring injustice to the attention of the company and the tribunals, while also on the side, we're working with very senior law enforcement on the side. It's not part of their official duties, but they have the experience to help generate and define the complaint system and process and ensure that what we do is just. Our next step is to engage attorneys on the international humanitarian law, international human rights law front. We're working through all of this with the goal on Election Day in the United States to open the tribunals up for public submission of information and complaints. Obviously, this will be very streamlined at first, but that participation and regular constitution of it will be advanced this fall. Now, I'm going to add here some exhortations, some guidance, some comments from the cadre based on events over the last couple of weeks. The first comment, there's so many intellectual men who have the ability that shun real achievement, that collect figures, etc., and lie low while doing so. A fuller, more satisfying life waits and wants to be taken. Stop filling your house with plastic toys from your childhood. Build real skills that give you the right to make an impact. Do you believe you have a right to make an impact? What separates you from the common man who believes he does not have the right to make an impact? He restricts himself to voting harder. He restricts himself to writing letters to his congressman or calling or even an email, knowing in advance that this is futile. Why does he not rise up? It's a question of prerogative and the heart. You must believe as a man that your conscience, your freedom, and your dignity grant you that inherent right and prerogative to stand for them, achieve for them, and impact history. You are not chattel. You are not born to be a slave. That simply must come from within you. To look, to see, to accept that duty of the state that you bear as a citizen. Here's our next question. It's very easy to only care about your own bubble rather than the direction of the world. Honor is what's at stake, and even in the Third World War, it will find you. What do you think you can escape? Leon Trotsky famously said that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And so many of the efforts today of churches, of parties, individuals, organizations, institutions, politicians, economists, even jurists, is to defer the consequence of the last 80 years of global mismanagement. The United States is now roughly $157 trillion in debt when you include unfunded future liabilities. That's not sustainable. That's simply impossible to prevent a crash. The abandonment of the United States industrial base, China has 300 times the shipbuilding. Maybe it's 200 times. We'll have to look it up. We did an article on that. Whether it's 200 or 300 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States, our manufacturing base is gone. Our industries have been shipped overseas, and financialization of the country has proceeded without let up for a generation. There are inevitable consequences for this, and if you think that you can defer them, sit back and escape them, or make a deal to be eaten last, you will fail. If you believe that you can fight by standing alone, you will fail. The only recourse that you have is first to listen to your conscience and what it tells you. That is the small, quiet voice of heaven that you know what is right and what is wrong. Don't lie. You know it when you hear it. Your freedom must be fought for. You either permit yourself to be enslaved or you fight. James O'Keefe said the other day, if your price is not your life, you can be bought. If you will not fight for your freedom, you are a prostitute in this arena of the age of militants. Think carefully about that. What is your price? What will it take for you to spit on your hands and raise the black flag, as I have done, as the company and the men of the movement and the officers of the cadre have all made their decision, not because I convinced them, but because they see and they listen to their conscience and they know when evil appears, it cannot, must not, ever be negotiated with. No parley and no quarter to evil is one of our values at the company. And it's incumbent on you to understand that on the other side, and as part of these grave assessments and decisions that you must make for yourself, absent me, absent the company, these requirements of manhood do not go away. Your dignity as a human being requires freedom, and it demands clear conscience. Think on this and ask yourself where in your life you need to make sharp correction on behalf of yourself, your loved ones, your community, and your country, the heritage and legacy of your people. Finally, nothing is lost. The future is ours if we take it with full recognition and acceptance of duty. Generations of men will benefit from the work we do here. The only way is forward, and it requires courage, bravery, and strength. We at the company understand that these are often frightening words. Recently, I was in Ohio to speak to a militant gathering. My families were there. So it was an interesting kind of an experience where to tone down my word because, of course, with children present, you don't want them turning, Daddy, when are the genocides coming? That's a bit too extreme. How do you want your genocides? Do you want unrestrained carnage, or do you want them on time and to specification? You're going to get them one way or the other. So we kept things maybe more family oriented. But the wife of the host said later, very powerful. You use scary words. Yes, we do. Scary times. And while we can modulate, while you should modulate your delivery, of course, in these very frightening times, watch who you speak to and in what depth. Nevertheless, scary words are important. Scary feelings must be handled. Scary ideas must be examined. That's that courage to step forth, the courage to listen to your conscience. I was watching a video the other day. Don't remember his name, but he's been on, I think he's a former SEAL. And he said that if you fake bravery, that's bravery. If you fake discipline and you do it, that is discipline. That's part of the secret, and that's one of the capacities you have as a human being. I encourage you from the company to think about those things. And whereas you worry about where the war is going to head, when the North American theater will open, are we facing a nuclear war? All of these frightening questions. What's going to happen to my children? What life can they possibly have with the economic collapse coming? All of these questions. Yes, it's frightening. We understand that at the company. There is a way, and it can be learned. We are here to teach, to lift, to guide, and instruct. And again, we are not a party or a church. We are the company. Our boots are just as cruel. Now, you've heard today an overview of many of the plans of the company, some of the projects we have underway, what we're doing with the tribunals, Flashpoint Europe, Project Silver Talent, the movement itself, and ground dominance across the United States. I tell you today, you need to think about these things, either as part of the company and the movement, or on your own as an individual. My warning to you is this: you cannot do it alone. If you have fantasy of lone wolf success, disabuse yourself of that before you attempt it. You will not survive it. That is not reality. Reality comes from men working in concert with correct leadership, of integrity, without ego. No cult of personality. No propped up and manufactured icons. Only truth. Don't lie. Always follow truth where it leads you in the dark. With that, I would like to conclude the broadcast. I'm going to give you some key engagement points here, where you can learn more, what you can do, and how you can advance yourself. Read the company reports, read my Substack. There are links on every company report. Study out the free academy resources that we have. We have a massive trove there of complementary education that you can seize and use immediately today. Join the movement if it's right for you. And watch for Militant Core open enrollment later this summer, early fall. Militant Core is our professional training program for those who take personal responsibility for the advancement of their people, the survival of their culture, the momentum of civilization, and its triumph. I'm Ivan Throne. I want to thank you for attending today, and we'll have this up on YouTube within the next few days.